Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to really zoom in and examine a remarkably brief, almost monolithic artifact of text. Sometimes the most profound inquiries aren't buried in massive volumes of data, but in the smallest, most isolated fragments. What we've got here is a tiny excerpt that holds this immense amount of atmospheric tension and mystery. It's a piece of source text that literally challenges us just by existing.
We're going to start by just sitting with the raw source material in its entirety. Who invented light bulb? Let the starkness of that isolated question really sink in for a second before we even try to deconstruct it. There's no surrounding context, no preamble, just this raw, unfiltered demand for information hovering right in front of us.
Which brings us to the Genesis fragment, a truly monolithic artifact. To really wrap our heads around this text, we have to treat it not just as a passing sentence, but as a profound, isolated fragment of knowledge suspended in a void. Think of it like an archaeologist gently brushing the dust off a single, solitary stone tablet. We're looking at an artifact that represents the very core of human curiosity. And notice the sheer constraint here. Exactly 5 words. That's it, 5. Yet within the boundaries of those 5 words, it manages to spark an eternal philosophical inquiry. In an era where we're constantly overwhelmed by an absolute avalanche of information, there's something absolutely breathtaking about a question that strips everything away to just 5 essential syllables.
So, let's analyze the grand title and the mythic framing surrounding this piece.
Before we tackle the core question itself, we've got to look at the incredibly grand, elevated language used to title this source text. The author didn't just label it history notes or science fact. No, they made a very deliberate, dramatic choice in how they wanted us to approach these 5 words. The Genesis of Illumination. Read that slowly. Notice how it frames the excerpt with this intense sense of awe. It suggests a biblical or mythological scale to the topic of light. It's prepping our minds for an epic narrative, basically positioning a simple technological query as if it were a fundamental story about the creation of the universe itself. It's heavy, it's dramatic, and it demands our complete reverence.
Let's break down exactly why that title carries so much weight. By using the word Genesis, meaning the origin or mode of formation of something, the text taps straight into our fundamental obsession with finding the absolute starting point. We don't just want to know how things work, right? We want to know the exact spark of creation. We're obsessed with point zero. Genesis implies a time before, which was completely dark, and a time after, which was forever changed.
And that brilliantly highlights the second half of the title. Illumination functions on 2 incredibly powerful levels here. First, obviously, there's the literal, physical creation of light, the physical bulb pushing back the darkness of a room. But second, and honestly perhaps more importantly, there's the metaphorical dawning of knowledge or realization, that state of being enlightened. This title is essentially suggesting that to ask about the origin of the light bulb is to ask about the awakening of the modern human mind.
Now let's look at the blunt inquiry itself and the massive shift in tone it brings.
So we've been floating in this lofty, philosophical space of Genesis and illumination, and suddenly we hit the ground going 100 miles an hour. This juxtaposition highlights the absolute duality of our source material. On one hand, we have this mythic, sweeping introduction. It's elevated, poetic, and grand. And then, slamming abruptly into it, we have this blunt, fragmented inquiry, who invented light bulb? It's abrupt, it's ungrammatical, it's incredibly urgent. It's almost like someone stepped up to a grand podium in a silent cathedral and just shouted a hurried question before running out the door.
If we break this blunt inquiry down into its core conceptual components, we can see exactly what the text is desperately trying to do. First, we have the who. This represents our deep psychological drive for human attribution. We need a hero to anchor the story. Next, the invention, the almost magical act of creation itself, pulling something completely out of nothing. And finally, the bulb, the incredibly mundane, fragile, physical object of focus that somehow houses this miracle. The text is literally trying to bind a human creator to a transformative object.
This leads us to the missing words, and quite frankly, a fascinating grammatical mystery. As any good investigator will tell you, sometimes the most important evidence is in the negative space, the things left out. So the crucial point isn't just what words are present, but the glaring, mysterious void of what's missing. Check out the grammatical anomaly here. We have a missing article before light bulb, and we have this highly unusual physical space right before the question mark. It doesn't say who invented the light bulb, it just says light bulb. This strips the sentence of all its polish. It gives it this frantic, urgent rhythm. And that floating question mark, it acts almost like a gasp for air, a physical hesitation in the text. It's raw data, completely unfiltered.
When you follow this deliberate reading process, first reading the words, then noticing the void, and finally questioning the absence, the text transforms entirely. The absence of a simple three-letter word like the turns a standard historical query into a desperate, almost primal demand for answers. It genuinely feels like a search engine query typed frantically in the middle of the night by someone who suddenly realized they don't understand the world around them.
Ultimately, we are left with an unanswered question, an eternal echo.
As we reach the climax of our analysis in this explainer, we have to confront a pretty beautiful reality about our source. The central premise here isn't about providing an answer, it is entirely about the sheer act of inquiry itself. The source doesn't tell us who did it, it only cares that we are asking. Isolating just the first two words reveals everything. Who invented? This points right back to that fundamental human desire for a Genesis story. We have this eternal, insatiable need to attribute massive, world-changing illumination to a singular who. We want to condense the vast, complex, messy history of scientific progress into a single name, a single face, a single moment of triumph.
Ultimately, this fragment leaves us suspended in a state of eternal curiosity. Who invented the light bulb? It doesn't give us the satisfaction of a name or a date. Instead, it forces us to look at this raw, unaltered question, with all its grammatical urgency and mythic weight, and wonder what answers might lie beyond the void. It asks us to consider not just the physical invention, but the very nature of human discovery itself. So, what is the next great question you'll ask? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep wondering and keep seeking illumination.